There's a mental habit most people repeat every single day, and Edgar Cayce warned it quietly shapes the outcome of their lives. Cayce called it misalignment. Not spiritual failure, not lack of willpower. Misalignment. A subtle drift between what someone believes they want and what their thoughts actually reinforce, hour after hour. And scientists are now seeing the behavioral signatures of this drift in longitudinal studies tracking decision patterns, stress markers, and neural pathway formation over decades. The pattern is consistent. People who report feeling stuck also show fragmented goal structures in cognitive assessments. Their stated priorities don't match their daily attention allocation. Cayce described this in thousands of readings spanning 4 decades, but he framed it differently than modern psychology does. He said alignment wasn't about discipline, it was about coherence. The mind, the body, the intent, all moving in the same direction, without internal contradiction. When that coherence breaks, everything else begins to fracture. If you're seeing this, stay close. The contradiction deepens. Most people assume alignment means having a plan. Cayce said the opposite. He said forced plans create resistance. True alignment emerges when someone stops mentally fighting their own nature. That's not passivity, it's precision. Knowing which thoughts to feed and which ones to let dissolve. Neuroscience has only recently caught up to this. Research from Stanford and MIT shows that people who practice non-conflicted intention, where their conscious goals match their subconscious rehearsal patterns, show faster behavioral shifts and lower cortisol baselines than people using willpower alone. Cayce predicted this in 1928. He told a stockbroker in Ohio that his financial collapse wasn't caused by the market. It was caused by the split between what he said he valued and what he actually prioritized in his thoughts each morning. The man dismissed it. 2 years later, he wrote back. He said Cayce was right. The moment he stopped lying to himself about what mattered, opportunities appeared that had been invisible before. But here's the first reversal. Alignment doesn't attract success. It removes the static. The opportunities were always there. Misalignment creates a perceptual filter that makes people blind to what's directly in front of them. Cayce described this as walking through doors that are open while staring at walls. Cognitive psychologists call it inattentional blindness, but Cayce's version was sharper. He said misalignment doesn't just hide information, it creates false urgency around distractions. People chase the wrong goals with real effort, then wonder why nothing works. And that's where the second contradiction appears. Effort doesn't guarantee alignment. In fact, effort often deepens misalignment when it's applied to goals that don't reflect someone's true structure. Cayce gave a reading to a woman in Virginia who wanted to be a teacher. She spent years trying, failed every certification exam. Cayce told her she wasn't supposed to teach in classrooms. She was supposed to teach through writing. She resisted, kept trying the old way. Finally, at 43, she gave in, published her first book. It became a foundational text in early childhood education. She later said the resistance wasn't external. It was her own refusal to see what was already clear. Researchers studying goal persistence versus goal flexibility have found similar patterns. People who achieve long-term success tend to pivot faster when evidence suggests their approach is misaligned. But they don't abandon the core intention. They adjust the method. Cayce called this holding the spirit, releasing the form. Modern psychology calls it adaptive goal regulation. Same mechanism, different language. Now the third reversal. Alignment isn't a one-time decision, it's a daily recalibration. Cayce said most people lose alignment not through dramatic failure, but through tiny, repeated compromises, a thought pattern they tolerate, a relationship they don't address, a resentment they nurture. Each one creates a small distortion. Over time, those distortions compound. The person looks around and realizes they're living a life they don't recognize. Cayce said that moment, that recognition, is the opportunity, not the problem. The problem was the slow drift. The recognition is the chance to realign. But here's what makes this unsettling. Cayce insisted that misalignment doesn't just affect circumstances, it affects biology. He told a man in Tennessee that his recurring illness wasn't genetic or environmental. It was the physical manifestation of suppressed anger he'd been carrying for 12 years. The man admitted it, started addressing the anger directly. 6 months later, the illness disappeared. No medication, no surgery, just alignment. Psychoneuroimmunology research now supports this. Chronic psychological conflict correlates with elevated inflammatory markers, disrupted sleep architecture, and weakened immune response. The body registers misalignment as a low-grade threat state. It doesn't distinguish between a saber-toothed tiger and unresolved internal contradiction. Both trigger the same biological defensiveness. Cayce understood this decades before the research confirmed it. He said the body is honest. The mind can lie. The body can't. When someone is misaligned, the body starts sending signals: fatigue, tension, pain, not as punishment, as communication. And this is where the deeper layer appears. Cayce said alignment isn't about becoming someone new. It's about removing what was never real. Most people, he said, are living according to inherited expectations, voices from childhood, cultural programming, fear-based decisions made years ago that calcified into identity. Alignment means peeling those layers back until what remains is the original structure, the self that existed before the conditioning. Developmental psychology research tracks this as individuation. Carl Jung described it. Erik Erikson mapped it. But Cayce's version was more direct. He said people don't find themselves. They uncover themselves. And the process isn't gentle, because every layer removed exposes a lie someone has been living. That's uncomfortable. That's why most people stop halfway. They get close to alignment, feel the discomfort of truth, and retreat back into the familiar misalignment. Cayce called this the resistance of the false self. It fights to survive because it knows alignment will dissolve it. Now the fourth contradiction. Alignment makes life simpler, but not easier. Cayce told a businessman in New York that once he aligned his intent with his actual values, decisions would become obvious, not because circumstances improved, because clarity removes confusion. The man tested it. Within 6 months, he'd left a partnership that had drained him for years, moved to a smaller city, cut his income in half, and reported being happier than he'd been in 2 decades. He said the decision wasn't hard. It was just clear. That's alignment. It doesn't create comfort. It creates coherence. And coherence eliminates the exhausting mental noise of conflicting intentions. Behavioral economics research shows that decision fatigue drops dramatically when people operate from clear, non-conflicted values. They spend less time deliberating because there's no internal debate. The aligned choice is obvious. Misaligned people agonize over decisions because every option triggers a different part of their fragmented self. Cayce said this fragmentation is the root of most human suffering, not external circumstances, internal incoherence. But here's the part that disturbs people. Cayce said alignment requires radical honesty. Not honesty with others, honesty with the self. And most people, he said, would rather maintain a comfortable lie than face an uncomfortable truth. He gave a reading to a woman who kept asking why her relationships failed. Cayce told her she didn't want a partner. She wanted validation. She wasn't looking for connection. She was looking for proof she was desirable. He said until she admitted that, every relationship would follow the same pattern. She stopped requesting readings. Years later, she wrote back. She said he was right. She'd spent a decade chasing relationships that were designed to fail because failure confirmed her hidden belief that she wasn't enough. Once she saw that, the pattern stopped. Psychologists call this a self-fulfilling prophecy. Cayce called it the law of resonance. What someone holds in their mind as truth will manifest as experience, not because the universe is mystical, but because perception shapes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. If someone believes they're unworthy, they'll unconsciously sabotage opportunities that contradict that belief. Not consciously, subconsciously. The mind protects its internal coherence, even if that coherence is built on falsehood. And this is where the fifth reversal appears. Alignment doesn't remove challenges, it removes unnecessary suffering. Cayce told a farmer in Kansas that droughts and market crashes were inevitable, but despair was optional. The farmer who stayed aligned with his purpose, feeding people, stewarding land, would navigate hardship without losing himself. The farmer who tied his identity to profit would collapse when profit disappeared. Same external circumstances, different internal outcomes. Alignment doesn't control reality. It stabilizes the self within reality. Resilience research confirms this. People with strong, coherent self-concepts recover faster from trauma and setbacks than people with fragmented or externally dependent identities. It's not optimism, it's structural integrity. When someone knows who they are beneath the circumstances, circumstances lose the power to define them. Cayce said this is what he meant by spiritual maturity. Not belief, not ritual. Structural integrity of the self. Now the pattern intensifies. Cayce said most people wait for external proof before they commit to alignment. They want a sign, a guarantee, evidence that alignment will work. But he said alignment only reveals itself through action. You can't think your way into alignment. You have to move into it. Take one step in the direction that feels true, even without certainty, and the next step becomes visible. Stop, and the path disappears. Cayce described this as walking by faith, but he didn't mean religious faith. He meant functional faith, trust in the process of coherence itself. Behavioral psychology research on commitment and action supports this. People who take small, aligned actions without needing full certainty show better long-term outcomes than people who wait for perfect information. The action creates feedback. The feedback clarifies the next action. Cayce said the universe responds to movement, not intention. Intention without action is fantasy. Action without intention is chaos. Aligned action is both. Intent embodied. That's when things shift. But here's the subtle cruelty. Alignment often requires letting go of what feels safe. Cayce told a school teacher in Illinois that her unhappiness wasn't caused by her job. It was caused by her refusal to leave it. She stayed because it was predictable. But predictability, he said, isn't the same as alignment. She was trading vitality for security. He told her that true security comes from alignment, not from circumstances. She ignored the reading. 20 years later, she retired, said she wasted 2 decades. Regret research shows that people's deepest regrets aren't about failure, they're about inaction. Not because the action would have succeeded, but because inaction meant never knowing. Cayce said this not knowing creates a low-grade grief that people carry for years. They sense they missed something, not an opportunity, themselves, the version of themselves that alignment would have revealed. And here's the 6th contradiction. Alignment feels risky, but misalignment is the real risk. Cayce told a lawyer in California that staying in a career that drained him wasn't playing it safe. It was guaranteeing slow decline. Physical, mental, relational. The safe choice, Cayce said, was alignment. Because alignment protects vitality. Misalignment erodes it. People think they're protecting themselves by avoiding change. Cayce said they're destroying themselves slowly, in ways they won't notice until it's almost too late. Longitudinal health studies show that people in chronically misaligned situations, jobs they hate, relationships they endure, identities they fake, show accelerated aging markers, higher disease risk, and shorter lifespans. The body doesn't tolerate long-term pretending. It breaks down. Cayce understood this in 1932. He told a patient that her heart condition wasn't structural. It was the result of 15 years pretending to be someone she wasn't. She changed. The condition stabilized. Now, the final layer. Cayce said alignment isn't individual. It's relational. When one person aligns, it shifts the field around them. Not because they preach or convince, because coherence is contagious. People sense it. They're drawn to it or repelled by it. Either response is useful. The ones drawn are ready. The ones repelled aren't. Cayce said trying to force alignment on others is violence. The only ethical path is embodiment. Be aligned. Let that be the message. Social psychology research on behavioral contagion and mirror neurons supports this. People unconsciously mimic the emotional and cognitive states of those around them. When someone operates from deep alignment, others feel it. Not as pressure, as permission. Permission to stop pretending. That's the real impact. Not what someone says, what they are. And here's the last reversal. Cayce said alignment doesn't guarantee happiness. It guarantees integrity. Sometimes aligned people are deeply sad. Sometimes they're angry. Sometimes they're grieving. But the sadness is clean. The anger is purposeful. The grief is real. Misaligned people feel numb or chaotic. Aligned people feel everything, but nothing owns them. That's the difference. Alignment doesn't remove emotion. It clarifies it. Emotion regulation research distinguishes between suppression, which is misalignment, and acceptance, which is alignment. Suppression increases distress. Acceptance decreases it. Not because the emotion disappears, because the person stops fighting it. Cayce said resistance to emotion is resistance to life. Alignment means letting life move through you without distortion. But here's what most people miss. Cayce said alignment isn't a destination, it's a direction. No one is fully aligned. Everyone is either moving toward coherence or away from it. The question isn't, am I aligned? The question is, am I moving toward alignment today? One thought, one choice, one moment of honesty. That's all it takes to shift direction. And Cayce said those small shifts, repeated daily, create a life that feels inevitable in hindsight. Not because it was planned, because it was coherent. The person, the choices, the outcomes, all pointing the same direction. Complexity science research on emergent systems shows that small, consistent inputs create large-scale pattern shifts. The system doesn't change all at once. It tips. And once it tips, the new pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Cayce described this as the tipping point of alignment. Once someone crosses it, Staying aligned becomes easier than staying misaligned. The momentum shifts. And here's the disturbing part. Cayce said most people never cross that tipping point. Not because they can't, because they stop right before it. They get close, feel the discomfort of the old self dissolving, panic, retreat, spend the rest of their lives wondering what would have happened if they'd stayed. Cayce called this the tragedy of the almost aligned. People who saw the path, walked toward it, then turned back at the last moment. He said you can see it in their eyes, a quiet, permanent sadness. But some don't turn back. Some keep walking. And Cayce said those people aren't special. They're just honest. They admitted the misalignment, admitted the cost, and chose coherence over comfort. Not once, daily. That's all alignment is, a choice made again and again until it's no longer a choice. It's who you are. And when that shift completes, Cayce said something strange happens. Life stops feeling like a struggle. Not because circumstances improve, because the person stops fighting themselves. The external world doesn't need to change. The internal world already has. And that, Cayce said, is when everything falls into place. Not magically, structurally. The person, the path, the outcome, no longer in conflict, just aligned. And once that alignment settles, it's unshakable, not because it's rigid, because it's true. But the question Cayce left unanswered is this: how many people will choose the discomfort of alignment over the familiarity of the lie?